Hi, today is January 30th, 2021. My name is Emily Ma, and I'm here with Pat Lindsay Catalia Buscaino for the Houston American Archives at Rice, Houston Asian American Archive at Rice. To start, where and when were you born?
I was born in Los Angeles, California, and I was born in the year of 1984.
Nice. And do you have any siblings?
Yes, I have one sibling. She's younger than me.
And how would you describe the household that you grew up in?
I grew up in a four-person household. It was my mother, my father, me, and then my sister.
Awesome. And how would you describe the neighborhood that you grew up in?
Hmm. The neighborhood I grew up in was I wouldn't quite say it was in the city of Los Angeles, obviously, right? But it wasn't in like downtown per se. It was more of like an urban area. And the best part of my neighborhood um, was that we lived on the same street as most of my family members. Different houses, like let's say across the street, down the street, in the same complex. And yeah, so it was a very tight knit community on that street, which was my neighborhood, my community. Um, and specifically, the area that most people know this area in is like Culver City area. And it was really before it became gentrified. It still is very diverse neighborhood.
Awesome. So kind of going off of that, like how would you describe the demographic of like where you grew up?
Mhm. Besides the fact that my entire family, extended family lived there, we were all Filipinos. There were several other Filipino families living on the block. And then there were also Latino or Latinx um, houses. Even like I remember one apartment complex that had at least 30 tenants in there, and a good majority were Latinx. I know there are a couple of African American, some other AAPIs, like a Japanese, um, family, and then some white families as well. So it's kind of mixed housing on the street. There were houses, there were, apartments, there were, or like small apartments and then large apartments. So single story homes, two-story homes. So there was different types of people living on that particular street um, throughout the 80s, or even before the 80s. My complex, the apartment that we lived in, was built in the 40s.
Wow, that's really cool. That's pretty old, yeah. Um, could you maybe describe some favorite memories of your childhood?
Yes. So I guess my favorite memories growing up are the fact that we spent a lot of time with our extended family, our relatives, mostly on my paternal side. And we would always celebrate like anything and everything from birthdays to holidays. And we would go to each other's homes, specifically my matriarchal aunt, to her home, and everyone would potluck, um, and we would eat all the holidays. Um, Beyond even that street, we had other like extended relatives who lived like on another street or another part of, I guess, the neighborhood or the town. And my most favorite memories growing up was during Christmas time, because there was a slew of birthdays, specifically my own sibling. Um, Her birthday was on December 24th. But we also, on top of that, would celebrate as a whole Filipino family, and we put on essentially a holiday musical production on those days for nearly 10 years. So I grew up from like the age of, I don't know, like 5 or even less than that, probably 4 or 5 years old, all the way until I was in high school. And each of our families would be its own like theater troupe, and we would perform and compete against each other. And there was about 5 families, and then other relatives and family members and friends would come over and watch, and they would be our audience. We would also have judges, and the judges were usually friends who were not Filipino. so so they would be like, would be either be my cousin's boyfriends or their coworkers. Many of them were non-Filipino, and so we'd have like an unbiased perspective. And so at the end of it, there was different awards, like who had the best show, who had the best costumes, the best music. So my holiday Christmases, and that goes into New Year's. My parents had an anniversary, their wedding anniversary is on New Year's Eve. So you can imagine that Christmas into New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, like was all just, family parties and gatherings and leftovers. So I had a very happy childhood
Yeah.
doing that.
That sounds like an awesome stretch of time, just like complete fun.
Yes, yes. And let me add, before that, we are also very Catholic. So in the Filipino Catholic faith, they have something called Simbang Gabi, where you do a 9-day, essentially it's like a 9-day mass leading up to Christmas. And my family would sing in that. So, singing and music and performing were a huge part of the entire Christmas holiday season. And so you're making me realize that now as I'm talking.
That's great. So kind of similar to that, what were some values that your parents emphasized in your upbringing?
Well, education was of utmost importance. Um, and that was seen through the way my parents put us through private school, specifically Catholic private school, our entire life. And they had to pay, to put us through school. Um, and I believe at this point, for me and my sibling, it's been a guiding north star, for our lives. Hence I think probably encouraging me, motivating me to get my doctorate's degree, to this point. So education is one, and the other thing is also like in the Filipino culture, respecting the culture and respecting the elders is kind of synonymous, right? So, following and abiding by, I guess, Filipino traditions or Filipino ways. Um, that's probably another important thing. And I think that's how me and my sibling are able to understand and for the most part speak the language. Not necessarily 100% fluent, but definitely we can do better than most children who are born here in America, because we're born here in America. And most Filipino American children don't really speak or even understand the language. So I think that was evident, with me and my sisters growing up.
Yeah, that's awesome. And kind of going off of education, so let's talk a bit about like your education growing up. So where did you attend elementary school and what was that like?
So I mentioned to you, we went to a private Catholic school starting when I was in pre-K, kindergarten. And I went through all of that through all the way up through 8th grade. Um, it was a diverse community. Now that I think about it, growing up, I was so blessed and so privileged at the same time to have many Filipino American classmates. So I grew up not only in a neighborhood full of my family, but I also grew up in essentially a cohort from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade of Filipino American kids. There's of course other kids in the class too, that were Latino, Latinx, Black, white, um, etc. So there were different folks in the school, and I was a very active child. Growing up, I was very quiet in the first years up until I reached like 5th and 6th grade when they started encouraging extracurricular activities. I wasn't into sports, unfortunately. I tried it, wasn't too great at it. I was more of a musical theater, choir singing kid. And so, yeah, I was very active in that. I was very academic as well, in the academic decathlon, and I won some speech impromptu competitions, and that kind of really projected my future into speaking. It started at that age.
Awesome. And could you talk about like any like specific jobs or extracurriculars that you participated in maybe during high school or middle school?
Okay, so in high school, I also went to a private Catholic school as well. It was an all girls school, and there I really flourished in terms of my identity, especially as a feminist. I think that was part of solidifying all the way into college. And I was even more active in high school than I think I was in grade school. Um, I was very religious and spiritual at that time as a youth, and as well as I wanted to be in some leadership positions. So, there was one year I was in student council as I think I was the vice president, I think of our sophomore year. And then the following consecutive years, I became the president of the liturgy club, which was focused on like creating the mass and when we would have mass in church at at the school, I would do that. Um, I was also part of the choir growing up, and high school, just like I was in grade school and in my Filipino community. And then the most memorable things that I did in high school in terms of my activities was being in the school plays. Because I had a talent and a knack for singing, I always got some kind of singing part that would lead me to my senior year, and I got the leading role my senior year of that play or that musical. And yeah, I loved that. I loved being in those musical and those theater productions, and just being an overall good student. And perhaps as I think back, perpetuating a lot of model minority stereotypes. I was kind of hard on myself as I think about it, because I felt like um, I had to behave or appear a certain way. I had to be the best at everything I could possibly be, and be focused on school, and not really be focused on, let's say, boys. um, that was something my parents also like really, you know, told us, like, focus on school, boys can come later on in life, after your college is what they said. After college, you can deal with that. So yeah, so that really propelled me to be an active student leader, and I gained a lot of confidence, through that.
Awesome.
So,
That's really
and
impressive.
and my classmates also, I was also privileged again to be surrounded by other Filipino Americans, or other Filipino Americans, as well as I started having classmates who are of different ethnicities in the Asian American community, like Korean, Vietnamese, um, Japanese. I honestly didn't even know that existed until I went to high school. So yeah.
Awesome. That sounds like a really good community to like immerse yourself in. Yeah. So
Yes, yeah, it's good. It was a privileged school. The other thing about my high school is there was a lot of wealthy children. And I didn't come from wealth. I mentioned to you we lived in an apartment, specifically a one-bedroom apartment. We didn't have our own bedroom. We don't have our own room. And so there was a huge disparity, a stark contrast of where I lived, and where I went to school. And so my parents, um, you know, paid for us to have this privilege. We could have gone to public school, and we could have, just went that route, but they wanted to give us the best, at least in their eyes.
yeah, it's really meaningful, and it's good that you were able to like attain this education. It's really good. Um, so I want to move on to college, but before that, can we talk a bit about your parents? So do you
Yes.
know when your parents immigrated to the U.S. and what motivated them to do so?
Yes. So my parents immigrated separately. They didn't meet each other in the Philippines. They met actually here in the United States. They separately, immigrated here in the late 70s. So between like 1978, 1979-ish, it is post um, martial law in the Philippines at this point. And it's like just the beginning of the 80s is when they got here. And for my paternal side, it was through the matriarchal sister that immigrated here first and established herself for probably half a decade to about a decade beforehand, working here in America, and then starting to petition my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, and then my father, here to America, specifically to Los Angeles, California. And then on my mother's side, same, almost identical. Her One of her matriarchal sisters immigrating here to America, working first in the Midwest and then moving down here to the South in Texas and raising a family, and then petitioning my maternal grandfather, and then even my mother from there, and coming out here. And so that's both my parents' lives were happening in parallel through immigration, but they didn't actually meet each other until my mother traveled to California for a vacation.
Awesome. And have your parents told you about experiencing challenges when they arrived, like any specific instances of cultural shock or discrimination?
Yes, there are a couple that kind of come up in my head. I think it's definitely a cultural shock, for both of them. Like in terms of the food, my parents never understood at that age, like at that time. My dad, I remember him saying, like, before, he didn't understand all the different types of diverse foods, like let's say Mexican food and burritos, or how big the French fries were at McDonald's. Or for my mom, it was like, not realizing that the microwave wasn't a TV. It was something to heat up food, So there was different things, like different cultural shocks, I think, for them, but because they had siblings and family here that helped them acclimate to the situation. I also know that, both of my parents experienced some type of discrimination. They've experienced also violence, you know, um, you know, a crime, I guess. My mom, when she was working, we were already here, we were already born. She experienced, essentially a robbery. I mean, somebody tried to steal from her and her coworker, and they succeeded. And that's very traumatizing. For my father, I remember we were very young, and Burger King still had a salad bar. We love salad. My dad loves salad bars, and so there were these two white boys who saw my father, and the area we lived was kind of predominantly white. At least the main parts of the area were still very white, and so those two little white boys started throwing tissue paper on my dad's plate. My dad's a little more heavy set. He's obviously brown, so, I didn't know at that time what that meant, but I think back now and I realize that was discrimination and racism, on my dad and probably on my family. So they experienced that even at work, a lot of the times in the work that my dad did, as a blue collar machinist or construction workers. Sometimes some of the ethnicities were pitted up against each other and would have arguments and fights. And so I knew things of that would happen for my parents. And I know it's a struggle, especially being paid. My mom said, starting off being paid like $2, $3 an hour, although yes, inflation is now more, but back then, I mean, that was not very much. And my parents were both college graduates, so there was definitely they see you differently when you work here, coming from your home country.
Yeah, that sounds really tough, but I think it's also impressive that they were able to get through that. Um, and hopefully things have improved a bit. So moving back to you, could you describe like what subjects you were interested in studying during college?
Yes. Okay. So, like getting to college, I did have a guidance counselor at the high school I was going to, but I didn't really have much guidance per se at home with my parents. Um, like they didn't know like okay what how to apply and you need to do your SATs. Like they weren't helicopter or tiger parents in any sense. They just, relegated all of that to the high school. I mean, they were paying a lot for the high school, so the high school better be telling you and teaching you what you need to do. And so in high school, I had decided, or not even just high school. When I was young, I said I want to be a doctor. And that was kind of my goal ever since, like, I think I was like in third grade. I was like, I'm gonna be a doctor, and that was kind of said throughout all this. I had no reason why I wanted to be a doctor. I had not really an interest in science, even in grade school. In high school, I made it a little more serious, and I really enjoyed biology when I took it. With the teacher that I had, God bless her, she passed away from cancer already. But that was a good class. I really enjoyed that. Um, I enjoyed my English and literature classes. I look back now, those were definitely my strong points, because I did well in my AP when I took AP English and literature, as well as when you take the AP exams. I was able to pass the English portion so that when I went to college, you didn't have to take it at least the first semester. So writing, I mean, I didn't really enjoy reading too much, but I read a lot in high school. So I realized that those were good subjects for me. I was always more of an artist. Now that I think back, I liked, of course, anything that was artsy, anything that was performing, singing, musical. Um, the sciences were tough. Even though I did my best, I rarely got bad grades per se in high school. Math was my toughest, and it was, I think, even through college. But I had to work my way through that. So I guess I assumed at that point that science was going to be my major into college, but even then I wasn't quite sure, because when I filled out my applications for college, I didn't like for there's like one master application for like this university system where I went to to college. And like for some of those colleges that I picked up, I chose different colleges at the university that were not necessarily STEM related, because I didn't know that there was, the College of Humanities and Social Science. So I thought, oh, there's science and social science. So I thought, okay, maybe this is where I need to be. So I would check it. So the college I ended up going to, I was actually misplaced during orientation in the wrong major, I guess you could say. Um, and I was like, I need to study biology. Why am I here? And they're making me sign up for for like anthropology or something. Like I don't even know what that is. So I was like, I think I'm in the wrong section. So then they sent me to the science area. But even then, the first year I was undecided. Um, undecided, like I didn't have a major decided, I guess. But I knew I wanted to be a doctor, a medical doctor, only because of this. Going back to that model minority stereotype, I felt like I had this pressure as either maybe as the eldest or to always be the best, and saw being a doctor as the career that was the best, specifically medical doctor. Um, and but honestly, I really should have been a humanities major, because I ended up first being a biological science medical track major. And then I decided last minute to change into biology, because I really didn't want to take the genetics class and I wanted to take a nice, easy last semester as a senior. And I decided to take other fun stuff like an Asian American class and a costume construction class, and then finish off like another, like a poly class or something like that. I also ended up minoring in women's studies as well. Um, Kind of like you, like to show to show a little bit more of my like diverse background if I were to apply to medical school. Like I'm not only just like into science, I'm also into some of the humanities. But I ended up actually really enjoying women's studies. um, and I think that kind of really solidified a lot of like my, I guess, a lot of the thoughts that I have. So that's kind of what I enjoyed, I think, in high school. I went right into college. I didn't even realize realize that.
That's totally fine. Yeah, kind of going off of that, for many people, college is like the time when they're inspired to choose a path for their future that they hadn't necessarily considered earlier in life. When
Hmm.
would you say like was the point when you first began to maybe consider going into Filipino history and culture? Did that happen in college or maybe later?
That is such a great question. So that moment happened in college. So as I was in college, there's kind of a little bit of an identity crisis changing from high school into college. I think that goes for any students. Um, and in college, I decided my first year because my parents, my mom and my aunt had said like don't get active in school, focus on your classes in college because it's hard. So my first year in college as a freshman, I wasn't involved in anything. I eventually became involved in like the latter half of the year in one thing. But I think that was not good because I was a student who always came from like being in extracurricular activities, doing something, being a leader in something. And so the year after my sophomore year in college, I decided, no, I want to be more involved. I want to be more active. And during the college fair, that they have every year at the beginning of the school year, I was walking around with my friends. And then there was this one Asian American boy who turned out to be Filipino. And he said, hey, come to my meeting. It was something about youth. I was like, okay. So I just, you just write your name down on all of these, student clubs. And this person ended up emailing me and saying, like, come to our YCOP meeting. And I was like, YCOP, like, is there police? Like, what is happening at this event? So I go, and the meeting is in the Asian Pacific Student Programs Department. They had an actual, you know, office space and like a common area room. And I went to this meeting not knowing even what was happening. It turned out YCOP standing for Youth and Community Outreach Program. And that was my first kind of like take on organizing amongst Asian or API students. And specifically, that program outreach to high school students who were AAPI in the local area. And so we would go into the high schools and essentially host rap sessions, which were just like workshops or little seminars or little activities to help the different high school Asian American clubs to understand their own API identity. So that was amazing. And I spent the next couple of years, after my sophomore year, being an APSP student leader, a coordinator twice and I ended up being the student coordinator along with other college students as the coordinator for 2 years. So I ended up enjoying that. We essentially, as college students, create the program and um, you know, and put it on, and it was on the weekends, and it would be different topics about being API. And so that really, I guess, woke up my API consciousness of the things that we are facing. Because my entire life I felt like I didn't know what the word privilege was at that age, but I felt like I lived a very protected and sheltered life, that I didn't really feel like I went through anything hard in comparison to, I guess, my other classmates. But that was me thinking in that point because I didn't understand. I had no concept of privilege. But I look back now and think I had a lot of struggles growing up because we came from such a stark economic background in comparison to my classmates that I went to, the white rich students that went to school. And so I didn't even know that that was the difference. So I started kind of realizing more, I guess, in college, who I was, who I am, and really expanding more of my Asian American identity than my Filipino American identity. I also got involved a little bit more in student life. They call it student life, or being part of the summer orientations that you would host. I'd be into that. I was into like other clubs as well, and um, I was playing more music because the Asian American mentors I had inside APSP, they played the guitar. So I played the guitar and the piano and I would sing. So it was, I felt a sense of belonging in college. And I also, once again in college, I was, it was a little complicated. And I didn't also feel like I was part of the Filipino American student association that was there. There was one there, and I had friends who were in it, and I was kind of in it. I felt. I ended up being also in a lead role in the PCN. They call it Filipino Cultural Nights, PCN, and those are huge in the West Coast. It's like it's akin to like Goodfill games here for Filipino American Texans. And I was a lead role again in that production, and that continued to solidify like my developing my identity being Filipino. So I was really lucky because the university I went to was like over 50% Asian American Pacific Islander. I would say maybe even like 60%, 40, between 40 to 60%. Most colleges out here in Texas, you'll be lucky to even have a 10%, Asian American, population demographics. So I had that tie my entire life. And then coming, here, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, to Texas, that really was a shock to me. I guess that's when I started realizing, oh, not everyone is all Filipino or Asian. I had to like reconcile that.
Yeah. It sounds like college was like a time where you began to like almost embrace your identity, I guess, and find your own path. So
I
that's
did.
awesome.
One last thing is, as a science student, I did all the check boxes that you needed as a science student to try to get to medical school. I even had clinicals with my then best friend, who is now my husband. We would go to clinicals. We would do all the things you needed on paper to look like a good science STEM student to go to medical school. The the only problem was the science classes were so hard for me. And it's not that I didn't study, but the material was just so hard to understand. And you don't really hone into your study skills until maybe like you're a senior, really. So by the time you're a senior, you finally know like your study skills, and you're like, oh, so this is how hard I have to study. So throughout my sophomore and junior, and even through my senior year, it was really hard to be a science student. And I really didn't, I thought I really wanted to be a biology student, but I didn't, it really wasn't meant for me. I tried my hardest. But as I was enjoying, like the other things were coming so much easier, being a student leader, doing Asian American Pacific Islander programming and writing, humanities, performing. Those were my strengths and my forte. And if I, could go back, I would probably tell myself, maybe you should switch majors, and like maybe focus on, we had ethnic studies at our university, and we had top leading researchers focused on ethnic studies, focused on Asian American studies. I could have easily majored in those, and probably should have, but I don't really regret it because I'm here and I got to where I needed to be. And science is still very important, and it really opened my eyes to everything. But it wasn't, I was doing a lot of robotic steps, actuate model minority, even though at that age in college I was told about model minority and I knew what it was, but I didn't realize that I was in myself internalizing it as I was in college.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very relatable. Yeah, especially like in the Asian American community, like following that model minority like path. Um,
Mhm.
Are there any like professors or mentors that left a lasting impact on your life during college? You don't necessarily have to say any names, but just like,
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of them were Asian American Pacific Islander. When I was in my women's studies course, because I really thought that was going to be a joke, I literally took a women's studies class just because it hit two birds with one stone. So you all know how that is. Like, it's an elective, plus it also covers like a general course or whatever. I took that class. It was a women in citizenship class, and I wasn't taking it seriously until like probably the latter half when my teacher started asking some really poignant questions. And she was an African American lady, actually. And she says, "You're really good at this. Like, this is some good stuff." I was like, "Yeah, this is women in citizenship. I never thought about that. Like, what's the point, you know?" And then she essentially encouraged me, or at least I was encouraged to take another course. I was like, yeah, maybe I should like minor in this. And then one of my favorite classes within the women's studies was a women, gender, and technology. And my teacher was a Japanese American woman. And at first, I wanted to take the class. I was like, I'm a science student and a women's studies minor. That's a great class to take, women, gender, and science. When I find out the class wasn't like about like STEM specifically, it was essentially a sociology kind of class. Like, how does technology impact women, or how women are seen, or how do these technologies impact the way women behave, and started learning about more things like more female oriented science, things like an IUD or birth control or contraception. I didn't know any of those things at that age and how that impacted women. So I was just like, wow, this is really cool. And I that was one of my favorite classes because I did a project. My final project was on skin discoloration technologies. And it was in the Filipino culture, skin whitening, as many cultures are, they're really into skin whitening. And I grew up using skin whitening technologies like soap and lotion. And we even use alum rocks that we would we would rub on our elbows, because any dark melanin spots were considered dirty. And so even to this day, that's a conception that a lot of women or the culture holds, so you utilize some of this. And so I did a project on that, finding out that using these um, products actually harm your skin and harm your health. And so that that class really helped intersect my identity, my academics, and even science, seeing science in a more humanity way versus just like, oh, here's an organic formula you need to convert into a catalyst or whatever you need to do. So that was one of my favorite classes to take, with a teacher who guided me through that process. I also have a couple of professors, who taught me in the Asian American course. He's very famous in the API sector in terms of research. And he even reached out to me when I was already living out here in Houston, because he came out here to present one of his books in one of the Asian American organizations. And then more specifically, my most favorite mentors were in Asian Pacific student programs in that department. Half of them were Filipino. So that also helped. So it was the first time I ever saw like older Filipinos who spoke only English, and they weren't like my parents who were native, Tagalog speakers. So it was really, I looked up to them. Even to this day, I look up to them. And one of my mentors, he just retired from the university, and we all, his former students, all sent messages to him. So I feel very blessed that I had those folks there. And I've stayed in connection with one of them who was my mentor for when I was in YCOP, when I was in the youth community. She eventually became a doctor, a doctorate in her field as well. And we met up at a higher ed conference, as essentially colleagues, but really I saw her as a mentor. And she, you know, we have to have mentors in our lives, especially in like college. Like that's such a revealing time for a lot of people. So if you don't have a mentor, go find one.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And it sounds like these classes and these professors left a pretty big impact on you. It's good to hear. Um, so, kind of moving past college, can you describe the general academic path that you followed after undergrad?
Yes. So after undergrad, I had more work life experience. After college, I was hired on by the university um, in one of the, I guess, administrative departments, and it was a little slow for me at first because I think I didn't know my purpose. But as I started helping around and doing things, I was like, okay, this is interesting. But I think I was craving my artistic side at that time. I was writing music, playing my guitar, singing. I had this vision that I wanted to do, like, I wanted to pursue my music. I wanted to sing. I wanted to write music and do open mics. And I had told that boss, my first, I guess, official supervisor for the job, just they were like, okay, all right. I think they were hoping to keep me on staff, but that didn't happen because I eventually moved here to Texas, essentially a year after I graduated from college, and I had to start all over, or like start from the beginning, trying to figure out, okay, what is it that I want to do? So it was a nice fresh start. So going back to my creative side, I was like, I always wanted to open up a bakery, and so I was like, oh, I want to let's experience this. So I took some pastry classes, but I was out of state, so that cost a lot of money. So I had to stop pastry school, and I ended up working at a pastry shop, and I worked at a boutique hotel, a very posh hotel out here in Houston. And that opened my eyes because I got paid more working in higher ed than I got paid working essentially a minimum wage job, waking up way too early and not seeing the light of day kind of thing, and the same thing. So it was a lot, it wasn't very glamorous being a pastry cook, even though it was very creative and really fun. At that point, I decided I am going to continue going back to higher ed. So I applied um, to a local institution, and my first job was essentially being a college recruiter and going out to high schools to recruit students to come to college, or community members. So I already had that experience going out into the high schools or in the community and college, because that's what we did in my Asian American program, right? So I was able to essentially do well with that and rise up in the ranks, and be able to advance in different managerial positions, administrative positions. And yeah, that was almost a decade of my life, and I really grew to love higher ed from there, realizing how much fun I had in college doing that kind of work, working at a college, and realizing I could get paid to do this for a living. And I did for a decade. And so while I was working at this institution, it wasn't enough to just have a bachelor's degree. The unspoken word was like, you need to advance and get your master's degree if you want to become, in a higher position. And my supervisors at the time were very supportive, and they themselves were trying to pursue higher educations. So it was always an environment where pursue your higher education, keep going, and don't stop. And I was a young professional, so I didn't, necessarily have major obligations except for my education. So I decided, um, I had just become a manager um, at that point, and I decided to pursue my master's degree. And I went to an institution who was looking for their first online cohort, because online schooling at the university level was still kind of very new, and so I was the first cohort, and it was very successful. And I enjoyed that program, learning more about higher ed, and the fact that it was online was so convenient because I could work and go to school at the same time. and then do that. And I paid everything out of pocket because I didn't want to have to deal with more student loans that I had to deal with in my bachelor's degree. And then afterwards, after I graduated from a master's degree, I decided I need a break. I need to take a year off. So I took a year off, and in that year off, I continued managing, and then I was able to once again apply for a doctorate's program. And what was great about this doctorate's program, the institution would be able to pay partial, could pay my tuition partially. And so that was always a win-win, in choosing. And so that was also a local institution, and that wasn't online, that was face to face. So I had to dedicate my time to going to school, also managing, like, full-time, supervisor, manager, work. And I did that. That was for a couple of years. And then I knew I wanted to focus on something Asian American, Filipino American on my dissertation. That, going, getting my master's degree and my doctorate's degree were a partial reason, not only to, fulfill my own personal goal, my own dreams, as well as my parents and my family. I felt getting my degree was a way to give back to the Filipino community and the Asian American community, because during my time when I was at that institution before my master's degree, I had created a educational program for Filipino Americans, youth and their parents, alongside FYP, which is Filipino Young Professionals. I was a member at that time. And so I decided to combine my expertise in the work that I did along with my community service work. And we created this programming, and we had several dozens of students go through the program, learning more about their career paths, and showing them the different options that you can become as a Filipino, not only just as a nurse, because Filipinos are known to be nurses, they could do so much more. So I knew that my degrees, my master's degree and my doctorate's degree, were going to be things I would contribute to the community. It wasn't only just for me. So that's kind of how it got me through my entire degree path, and how I, really decided and chose I really want to do something with the Filipino American community in my dissertation, because no one really is doing that out here, at least where I was living here in Houston. And so I knew I wanted to do something special.
That's awesome. It sounds like you were finding like your own path in life and then also helping other people find their path in life, which is pretty cool.
Yes, I was. I was advising, helping students, getting them from the beginning of college all the way through the end to graduation, and transferring out to universities, and then even seeing them at that point. Many of my students are older now. They're married, they have families, they've graduated, they've even continued on to graduate school, and are probably at this point finished up. So yeah, I'm a huge proponent of education, because it does change people's lives, and it changes, family trajectories, who, especially the students that came our way, a lot of them were first generation, many of them first generation college students, as well as first generation, let's say, immigrants, or second generation immigrant coming from families. So, college was a reach for many of them, and we had to motivate and encourage them the entire way.
Yeah, I think you definitely had a big impact on these students' lives, so that's really good to hear. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, sure. Um, so for your career, could you describe your current role as president of the Filipino American National Historical Society here in Houston?
Yes, so I'm very proud and honored to be the president of Filipino American National Historical Society, the Houston, Texas chapter. I am not the first, I am the second president, because our first president, Ms. Christy Poiseau, she founded it and started it in 2015. And I was one of the founding chapter members at that time as well. So I've been part of FONS essentially for since 2015. But in some of those years, I had to like lay low because I was in my doctorate's program. So, when you're full time or when you're a full time worker and student, you have to focus on school. So, and as a Fonz, so now that I've graduated from school, and focusing on this, I was appointed, as the president last year in 2020. And so, the Fonz is a very important organization, not only locally, but nationally. So on a national level, the Houston chapter is part of this national umbrella, Fonz. Um, and they have been around, the organization has been around since 1982. So even before I was born. And the goal is to, promote, to preserve, to raise awareness about Filipino American lived experiences, essentially the history of Filipino Americans here in the United States. And you do that through programming, through publishing books and archiving artifacts, and essentially preserving your history and your culture. And as I'm doing that now, so we're doing multiple things. As the president of a nonprofit, you know you have to split your time with the creative and creation along with the administrative and essentially like the business side of things. And so for these next couple of years, our goal is to build real strong infrastructure in terms of, making sure we have a strong membership, making sure we have strong leaderships, people in place to continue this work in the next couple of years. And so we've also developed a program agenda for the whole year, a calendar, essentially an event calendar for the year, so that we know what we will be offering to the community. And we have goals, future goals, which we have planned out in this tenure to really establish a very strong nonprofit for at least the next 5 to 10 years, where we can start applying for grants hopefully, and start really growing the staff and the infrastructure so that we can do even more for the community. In terms of what Fonz has done in the past, we've hosted events where we've brought in Filipino American authors, and hosted essentially, authors to, present their books or do a writing class. We've also done Filipino American History Month is celebrated every October. And it is Fonz, the national organization, that was able to get it passed in Congress so that you can have an actual National History Month in October. So this organization is making some big moves in the Filipino community. And I'm very proud to be a part of that and to continue to shape this organization. And not to mention that even if I have a title and the rest of the team that is part of, leading this group, we are all on our own journey. We're all on our own personal growth and ethno-racial identity development. That Fonz is beyond the administrative work that we do as leaders, right? It's part of growing us as people, as our identities as Filipinos or Filipinx or Filipino Americans. And because maybe I was so privileged, I like think back now, even talking about it now out loud, I'm realizing how privileged I was to have such a strong Filipino American upbringing, even up to college, and being surrounded by other APIs that may not necessarily be the experience here in Houston, Texas for Filipino Americans. And so I feel like Fonz and the other organizations that I'm part of really make that whole for the community, meaning like the things I had at an institution, at the college, right, or even growing up in my neighborhood and having, these networks of Filipino Americans and Asian American Pacific Islander communities. That's here too, but it's not really institutionalized per se at the college or university level across the board in the state of Texas. In the state of California, it is. So it's the norm. Here it's not. There is not really an ethnic studies. We have only one institution locally here in the university setting that actually has an Asian American studies department. So I feel like moving here, even though the infrastructure, let's say, isn't as strong as what I had back in California, because Filipinos are in the masses, because California is the state with the largest population of Filipinos. We come in about like third or fourth on the census. So I always say that the struggle is here in the South. And it's not bad. It's actually really great because it allows me in my position as now a doctor, right, of some title, right, or even being a community leader, I have the capacity to be in power and empower others to learn more about their identity and to utilize who they are and where we come from for the better of our community. And I always felt that, I guess, as a youth, as a young girl growing up, like if I have power, then I want to make sure I give it back to those who are in need of a voice or to stand up for themselves. And I believe through Fonz, as we document who we are and the experiences that we go through and continue to do so, as we are doing now today, this is how we speak up, and this is how we are visible in the community. This is how we represent.
Yeah, that's a really important role. It's like powerful and empowering. So it's really good. Um, so you've mentioned online that you started documenting your family history because like of the time you spent with your paternal grandmother. Could you maybe talk a bit more about that relationship and how it inspired you?
Yes. So when I was a young girl in my young teens, in school, right? I told you I was reading, we were reading all these books we needed to, because I was in like AP literature or something ridiculous. One of the books we read was a multi-generational female perspective. And this young girl had a mother and a grandmother, I believe, and she was like, experiencing her life through this lens. And I think she was like interviewing them or listening to their stories or just observing. And I realized after reading that book that I have my own like multi-generational female lens, and that the oldest person in my family was my paternal grandmother at the time. And I thought she's the link to history, to the past, to what was before in the Philippines and her own life. And oh my gosh, I'm talking about her because today is her death anniversary. And so realizing that now, getting a little emotional, that it was because of her and her story and the life that she went through, I was interested in finding out more about her, because I knew that she was going to pass away one day, to have to be confronted with death at a young age. Then I guess that's when I realized my grandma's not going to be here forever, taking care of me, wiping my butt, feeding me, and being a great doting grandmother. Because she helped raise us too, essentially growing up. So I did everything in my capacity to record my grandmother. Now at that time I didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have cell phones you could just record, or YouTube, anyone. So I would just, when I would take care of her or spend time with my grandma, which was many times, a lot of my time was spent with my grandmother, I would just ask her questions about what was your life like in the Philippines? What's your favorite color? Who were your boyfriends? Who were they? How did you meet grandpa? And so I would ask these same questions over and over again, and I would write it down. And so I would write them down on anything that I had. At one point, I had like a paper bag just writing, about my grandma's life on a paper bag. And eventually I typed it up when we eventually had a computer, or I was able to type it up in school or something. And I currently have them right now. It's not necessarily digitized, but I think it's very important that I do. That's kind of a project that I have. Um, and I feel really blessed that I was able to find out minute things like, when her birthday is, who her siblings were, who her parents were, where she came from, where she was born. Um, and I guess I always have that with me. I was always the grandchild who was very interested in it. I don't think any of the other kids, grandchildren were interested in it, but I feel like I have a piece of her always with me, always in my heart, always not only in my heart, also written down, which also expanded to me trying to interview other relatives, because I grew up with my paternal side. We're very close to them. I started interviewing some folks as well, like other relatives. And yeah, I it's nowhere near, the Houston Asian American Archives at all by all no any means, but you know, writing it down and having it documented, I think is just something that's so important, because those stories are proof and living evidence of, the life of Filipino Americans and the struggles that they went through. My grandma would share stories about World War II. I mean, I didn't know she was joking because she would make light of it. She would say like, oh, they would run to the mountains that she saw, I think either a relative, like either her sister's baby or someone's baby thrown up in the air, and then the Japanese would um what is the word? What is that called again? I'm the guns with the knives at
Oh,
the end. I
the
forgot what they're called.
bayonet, like,
Bayonets.
uh,
Yes, they they would throw the kids and they would kill the babies with bayonets. I mean, they were killing everyone and anything in sight. And they lived in a village, and so they had to run to the mountains and hide in the mountains because I guess the Japanese wouldn't go up that far. um, and but I never got full details because it's hard when you're older, right? And to relive that trauma. So even just mentioning that, even though she was trying to be funny or make a joke out of the ridiculousness of that kind of death, I know it happened, you know. So yeah, so when she passed away, before I moved to Texas, really that year I moved to Texas before we moved in 2007, we spent as much time as we could, with her, getting her story. We even interviewed her on video, I think, at one time, and she would get tired sometimes, like, why are you videotaping me? But this is important. We're gonna have this forever.
yeah, I think that's really powerful, and I think your grandmother would be really proud to see like how far you've come, and also like her role in helping you.
Yes, I was so lucky to have my grandma come to my bachelor's degree, like the graduation for my undergrad. So, she went to that and saw me graduate. I was able to sing the national anthem at that particular graduation. So I got to perform too. So, it was great. And I wish she was still alive for my master's and even my doctorate's degree, because, no one in my family has been able to receive this particular level of education. Not that they can't, but I know it's something that the family can be proud of, like that someone where my grandparents came from, as my grandma didn't graduate from college. She didn't even really graduate grade school, from what I know. Like she probably went all the way up to seventh grade, and became a seamstress and eventually a farmer, in her life, and a homemaker. And to come from that, to come from people, who work the land, to what I'm doing, it's a huge generational jump in terms of economic status and even social status.
Definitely, yeah. That's insane. I'm glad you have her and like her stories, so like you can remember her by that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, So, when you were a young child, do you think you could have ever imagined yourself in your current career?
No. No, because when I was a young child, I only knew of one path, and that was to become a doctor, a medical doctor, or something in the medical field. Because many Filipinos are in the medical field, and most especially here in Houston, Texas, because of the medical center. Um, Medicine, allied health is is a great way, is a great career path, but it's not necessarily the path for every Filipino American. And I think that's what motivated me working at at a college institution, helping youth as well as adults figure out what they wanted to study. And many a times I had to be a mediator for parents and Filipino kids who are trying to figure out their majors and what they want to do in life. um so I didn't see myself being a community leader for the Filipino community, as something. But I guess I realized that's what I wanted to do after college. Like I want to be, something in the community where we're helping and giving back in any way, shape, or form. So I wish we could have children believe and think that I could be like, a community organizer or activist as an actual career and as a job. You know, um, we do this for the love of our community. Fonz is a 100% volunteer, um, membership driven organization at this point. It may change in the future, which is part of my goal in terms of my leadership. I would like to see more than just that. I want to have jobs for Filipino American youth or, post college students who want to be, let's say, an executive director and actually has a salary and this is a viable career, so because it's this work is so important. I keep thinking in my head, and I wrote this in my dissertation, if I don't write about this or if we don't do this, then who will? Um, and so I can only hold myself accountable. I can't make or force anyone to do anything. So I know that I feel charged to do this type of work in my community in any way, shape, or form. I'm not going to save the world, but I'll try to do my best, to contribute and give back so that there's resources for my community, because people are not creating purposely for my community, and I keep asking, if not us, if not me, then who else will it be? So I think that's what I'm working on as not only in Fonz, but just even in my future goals, like how can we now get the young Filipino, you know, kids and youth, my nieces and nephews, to say like, yeah, this is work I want to be and I want to do. But in order to get to that, your childhood, your growing up needs to be filled with not only just positive Filipino American experiences, but also ways where you get that challenged and you learn more and you dig more. And so, we don't necessarily have that in terms of like, school institutionally where, Filipino kids can go to. We don't have like a Chinese school because Chinese Mandarin, Cantonese schools, like those are popular, right? There's a lot of those. Well, in the Filipino community, we don't have that here in the South. There isn't a school to go to learn the language, to learn the culture and be connected. It becomes a responsibility of the family and the parents, but many parents and families don't have time to teach their kids that because they're working, they're trying to survive, they're living an immigrant lifestyle, trying to work their way through. And so I feel like that's kind of part of my calling, I guess, to continue doing things for the community where we can, advocate and empower all ages. So Fonz is that, and we're hopefully, going to expand it as we grow in terms of the people who are in it, and we can expand our programs as well. So no, I didn't think I was gonna be in this position. Honestly, I really thought, and I probably could still be, I really thought I was gonna continue in like the college institution portion, but I've been noticing, I think nonprofit has been a good calling for me, as well as, just carving my own path, because people with a doctorate's degree are doing probably one of two things. Usually they're either teaching, or they're doing administrative work, or they're like researching and writing papers and books, and all those things are great, you know and I'm not to say that I can't do those. I could, do those, but I feel like my calling at this point is to really, continue community organizing with funds, and then also even just in my own fulfilling my own personal goals, that will help the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds like a really powerful, like grounding principle, kind of. Um, so, in terms of like the community, besides Fawns, can you talk about some other organizations or programs that you've been involved in, either currently or in the past?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned to you that I was in Filipino Young Professionals when I first moved here. That was like the first organization I was a part of, and actually it was one of the founding members of the organization. um, and essentially it was a multi-generational young professional organization. People tend to get a little hung up on the word young, but it was young at heart, and anyone who essentially was Filipino. It really served a role that was in between post college and before like our parents organizations, because there's Filipino organizations that were created by what I call our parents generation, or I guess it's the what do we call this, what do we call our parents generation, the boom. I don't want to call I don't want to say anything.
Rumors? I'm not sure.
I guess it's the boomers generation. Yeah, everyone who's retiring right now, essentially. So at the time, there's these long-standing Filipino American Houston organizations. And there's always some kind of youth component to it, but many of those youth would go to college, and then they would have their college Filipino student, like the college student experience being in those associations. And then after college, it really wasn't anything unless you continued, you maybe hanging out with your parents and their organization, but it's not like you were going to take over the organization. You were just kind of there as part of the community. FIP really, I feel at that point, came in as a space for a lot of people who were in between that age range, between, let's say, 25 and 45. Right. There really wasn't anything. There wasn't a Fawns chapter, at least here in Houston at that time. So, and that's where I was able to really establish myself as a community, a leader in the Filipino community, was through that. And like I mentioned to you, creating the educational workshops, which we also like held a festival in as well. So I did that. My family, like I said, is also Catholic, and they're in a Catholic Filipino religious community. And I would also sometimes volunteer my time in terms of singing for the choir. My parents, before COVID, very, very active in their prayer meetings as well as the choir. And so that was also, because of by way of my parents, we were associated with that. And then more recently, of course, there's Fawns, and then there's this new artist organization, Filipinx Artists of Houston. And essentially, FXAH is a collective of artists from multi backgrounds, anything artistic related, and you're Filipino, essentially it's just a free and open collective group. And so I know a lot of people through that network as well. And also, there's also this very big and strong Asian American Pacific Islander nonprofit called OCA Greater Houston. And so I've known about OCA since my early days here in Houston. Because I was doing so much work, I guess at that time, I was awarded by OCA Greater Houston as like an outstanding API employee. at that time. And so I was able to get to know OCA at that time and then get to know some of the people there and, help out now with some projects that OCA Greater Houston is doing, specifically like working on, some diversity, equity, and inclusion programming and kind of helping with that. So those are a couple of, I guess, organizations that I'm a part of. And then because the Filipino community is essentially pretty tight knit in many ways, I'll get pulled into, like, hey, do you want to help out and be an MC for this or a panelist for this or a speaker for this? So I wouldn't necessarily say I'm not part of those organizations, but I'm always kind of helping or assisting the Filipino community like niches, because there's so many, there's like over 50 organizations out there. And yeah, so if Unipro, for example, is another, it's a new, young, fast growing Filipino American organization here in Houston. And yeah, so they've asked me to help for some things like, oh, can you be a graduate, commencement speaker? I'm like, yes, I'm so, honored to do that. So I wouldn't necessarily say I'm in that organization, but our organizations all work together. And I think that really combats like any idea of crab mentality. Is just kind of working in alliance with many of the organizations from different backgrounds, in generations, and even in different cities. So like, we have a brand new member who lives in San Antonio, and this person is very active in that community and with their chamber, and has invited me as a Fonz leader in Houston to participate in an event, that they have. So yeah, there's a lot that I have gone through. I mean, there's probably a bunch more on my CV or my resume. I can't think of, but I think I've shared the most essence, yeah, of it all. Because I'm thinking, is there anything else? Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of it is like just like, I guess, people in the network. Even sometimes when we host events, like back in the days, and like when I just moved out here in 2007, so 2008, 9, 10, 11, even through those years, we were organizing events not through a nonprofit. We were just like, we need to come together and raise funds for, let's say, a hurricane that happened in the Philippines. So it wasn't necessarily like, oh, we're a nonprofit or we're a group. We're just like, we're Filipinos who need to come and organize together and, do something good for the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm not sure if this is like tied to an organization, but could you describe your involvement with the book Filipinos in Houston?
Yes. Okay. So Chrissy Pazzo and Jenna Maravilla and I think they've both been interviewed through Ha already. They are the main writers and editors of the book. And my role, along with several other folks, was, to help contribute to the book, whether that's encouraging other Filipinos to submit pictures as well as quotes along with those pictures. So I tried to help with the best of my capacity, because I was in like deep in grad school at that point with my doctorate's degree, trying to finish off my dissertation. So I was focusing on that. But but in the meantime, I remember hosting, because Christy and Jenna would host on the South Side, they would host um, like scanning photo parties. It sounds weird. Like they would scan photos. They would get the community to come together, bring all your photos, and you would scan it, because that's the premise of the book. The book essentially is a visualization of pictures of Filipinos as early as the 1960s, 70s, all the way to present day. And so I wanted to do one for my community. I live on the opposite side of Christy and Jenna, and so I just felt like there wasn't any representation on this side of town. So I decided to host my own little thing at the with the local Filipino restaurant, because I knew the owner there. They were friends with my parents in the religious community. And so I hosted it there. We had a couple of folks, bring out their photos, and that's how I contributed, alongside with maybe some historical things. Like I had found something on the news about Filipinos in essentially what was like the World Fair. There was something called No Suit Ho Carnival here in the early 1900s in Houston. And essentially, it was a cross between like Mardi Gras and a World Fair, like at St. Louis in Missouri. And so they had that, and they brought over from the Philippines Filipinos who were Igorot, and Igorot Filipinos were are are darker complected, and they were visualized, or they were represented as tribal savage people in the entire carnival here in Houston. Um, and they were like the main event because they made them wear the tribal costumes and like eat dog and essentially behave as if they were primitive. um but the funny thing is, many of those folks who came here through this carnival, they had just gone through, Spanish colonization. And so it's not like they were primitive. They were forced to have to behave as if they looked like they were like native savages, but they weren't. There's not very much history per se about those Filipinos who came here on this carnival, but there was a picture that I had seen in like a news article, and I gave it to Christy. I was like, hey, look at this. We've got something as far back as I forgot the date. It was like the early 1900s, like 1911 or something, between 1909 to 1911. And it was like a postcard size. And I think they took that information and they went to the direct source at the library in Houston to kind of find it and do that. But I put that image in my dissertation as well, because that's not something we talk about, or that even Filipino American Houstonians know about. That one of the first Filipinos at the turn of the century were here as essentially zoo exhibits. And so yeah, so I thought that was critical. I'm glad to help contribute. And I honestly, it was really Christy, Jenna, and some other folks like Lizelle Compass and Anthony Guevara. They contributed so much to the project. Many of those pictures are from their families and their communities. I'm not a native Houstonian, right? So I don't have roots I do have roots as far back as like the 1970s because of my aunt. But they were born and raised here in Houston, so they have a lot of that documentation. So that was my contribution, to it. And then even now we still have books, and so as part of FONS now as the president, because it was a project under FONS, we still promote and sell the book, and we're hoping in the future that we can create, not just the future, hopefully soon, we create a curriculum around the book so that we can teach essentially the book and the stories, or the chronological time frame that's in the book.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting book. I definitely did not know that about like the festival. That's kind of disturbing, but important to know. Yeah.
It is very disturbing. I want to do more research around it. It's been a little bit difficult, but there's at least a picture, a day, a date, and who the people were. Yeah, and so it's really interesting. And on a side note, the first Asian American that graduated from Rice University was a Filipino American gentleman. So, he graduated from your school, from Rice University. So he's also in the book as well. And the book it's an easy read. It's like an adult picture book is essentially what it is. It's family photos that are beautiful from different generations. And so yeah, if you have a chance, or maybe one day we get to meet, we can show you the book, or it's at your library. It's at the Woodson Research Center exactly. So you could always see the book.
Oh, that's awesome. Fondren? Like Fondren Library?
Yeah, at the Fondren Library. So inside, right inside the Fondren Library, there is the Woodson Research Center. Um, it's like glassed off, and but it's probably closed right now because of because of what's happening. But in there with Amanda Foki, she is the head archivist there, and they house the what's the name of your yearbook?
I think it's a Campanile or Campanile. Camp,
Yes, or
yeah,
Campione or
yeah,
something like
something
that,
like
right?
that.
In those yearbooks is one of the first classes, and his picture is in there. Like that's where the picture inside the Filipinos in Houston book. That's where they got it from your research center, and they took that picture. So yeah, so there's history of this man, right? One of the first Filipinos at the turn of the century who was living here and is very educated, or like went to a very prestigious school, so they have some y'all have some information on his life, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm actually going back on campus pretty soon, like February 14th. So I can, if the library's open, I can check that out. So kind of moving back to like focusing on you, um, how do you identify yourself? And this can be like ethnic identity or just like any other describers.
I identify as Filipino American, um, and within that, I will also either written or verbally will say a couple of things. I'm Filipino American, I'm Filipinx, I'm Filipina, I'm Pinay. Um, I don't really usually say I'm Pinoy because Pinoy, is a general term for Filipino Americans, but I would rather call myself Pinay because I'm a female Filipino. Um, yeah, recently Filipinx has been a name that's been coming up, at least in the academic sense, kind of taking or lending from Latinx, um, that terminology. So putting the X at the end of Filipino. I think at one point in my life I was also saying Filipino, like with a P instead of an F. Um, but identify as Filipino American, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, or sha. SIYA. Sha is essentially like a gender neutral word for them in the Tagalog language. And yeah, that's, I think, and I'm also second generation in terms of coming here. I didn't come here to America. I was born here in America, but come from an immigrant family. But I am first generation college going student. And just explain that a little bit, how that can be confusing, because I mentioned earlier that my parents both graduated from college, but they graduated in the Philippines, and the education in the Philippines, I mean, it's good, it's great, but it's different from here in America. And my parents essentially, their college experience was different from my college experience. American students have choices. Back then, for my parents, they didn't have a choice in terms of what career or major. Their parents enrolled them and decided what they were going to study. And so the entire process was different. So I call myself, and I call my students who are Filipino, and they're the first ones to go to college here in America, as first generation. That's important because um, when you're trying to apply for financial aid or scholarships, right, you have to list, if your parents or who have gone to college. Well, there's more than just saying my parents went to college, but they went to college in a different country, not in the American system. And so it's as good as saying my parents don't know anything about the college system here in America as immigrants. And so I think that's important to note. I think that's all of the things that I identify with, and also even just in terms of, I guess, sexual identity as well as gender identity. I identify as female, um, cis female. Is that yeah, cis? Is it no? Yeah, I think so. Just like making
Yeah.
sure I'm saying the word cis female, and heterosexual essentially. So, and I'm yes, and of course I have a partner, and yeah, so that's kind of how I identify myself moving forward. Hopefully I have other titles, as I get older and hopefully grow a family.
Definitely, yeah. Um, do you have any like memorable stories or experiences of when you faced challenges with embracing or reconciling with your identity or your identities?
Yes. Even though I grew up in a very Filipino American family, my parents, like, when you get into arguments or and you're trying to reason with your parents. Am I okay? Like, because I see something spooling. Okay. My parents would be like, don't reason, don't talk back, don't reason out, because in the Filipino culture, you don't talk back to your parents or you don't give them any reasons. But in the American culture, it's okay to essentially defend your stance and to debate and to explain where you come from so that the other can understand. That's kind of the premise of our democracy, right? Right? So, but for them, there is no explaining, there is no, justifying. And so they would say something to the effect of, you're Filipino, not American. And so, but the thing is, I was born in America, right? I was born in America and I am Filipino at the same time. And so, um, when you're going through that as a youth and growing up, you don't realize that there's a tension between your, ethnic identity and your nationality, which is being American. So I knew what my parents were saying when they said be Filipino and not American. Um, they were essentially saying, follow the Filipino ways, which is the ways we're teaching you, not what the Americanized, which is huge. The word Americanized is like a huge thing in our community. Like, oh, that's too Americanized. And Americanized means white. And I guess the other word is like too independent or not of the collective. You're an individual. You're not part of us, is the implication of Americanized. So there's a couple of values that we have in our community, which is you have to be part of the us. You're part of the community. You can't be the other, and so in order to be one of us or one of the Filipinos in the community, you've got to follow like the Filipino ways. So we grew up knowing that. And that's, I think, why we, you know, um, learned Tagalog or learned the language or watched the video. We watched movies, listened to music. And that was further solidified, I think, when my cousins from the Philippines moved here when we were at a turn of our teenage years. So like we were preteens going to teenage years, and they were straight from the Philippines. And they came here and they spoke Tagalog and a little bit of it, like, good, decent English, but we learned a lot more from there. And I think that's what solidified my Filipino culture, because those Filipino cousins came here and they brought their culture to us, and we learned so much. Before that, I knew I was Filipino. We danced Filipino dances. We could understand. I had Filipino friends, classmates. Um, we ate Filipino food. We still watched the TV, but there was a bit of shame associated with it. And I remember the shame specifically when I was watching Filipino TV. Um, they have Filipino TVs at the Filipino restaurants in California, because those were one of the very few places you could actually watch Filipino TV, because it's cable. You have to buy it, right? And we didn't buy Filipino TV at our home. That was too expensive. So we only got the free channels on the PBS stations or whatever it was. And so when I was at the Filipino restaurant, the one I really remember was as a young girl, getting my Filipino food. I was like watching this, and I was just like, it was a variety show, and they were dancing and singing, and specifically singing and dancing to like English music, like pop music that I was listening to as a young girl, like at that time, whether it be like Britney Spears or whatever it was. But they were singing and dancing just like them, and I thought, oh my gosh, these Filipinos are wannabes. That's what I was thinking in my head. They're like, they're trying too hard. Like they're trying to dress in like, pop culture outfits and singing. And I just thought, I felt so embarrassed. Not by me. I felt embarrassed for them, the people on TV, the Filipinos who were dancing and singing, like trying to be American or Americanized. And I think at that point, that's when I realized that there's a difference. Those who are from the Philippines, and then there's Filipinos like me who are here in America, who I guess I had this sense of righteousness, like, well, I can speak English, and that's my culture, like listening to this American English music without an accent. So I guess I felt that way growing up until those cousins came, which I just shared with you, and that flipped it all over. Like then I started seeing the Filipino dancers as my idols. I wanted to be those Filipino dancers and singers, and I ate that up. So it kind of was like a reverse. As I was like, I realize now, like those people are the real, like not real Filipinos, but they're Filipinos and they enjoyed singing and dancing just as much as I did as a Filipino American. And so the fact that me and my Filipino cousins and me as a Filipino American cousin, we were able to bridge and connect together. I think that's when I was able to reconcile a lot of my Filipino identity. If that didn't happen, I think I would have continued thinking the other way, which is having this kind of shame around being associated with those type of Filipinos, which is so bad. As I'm saying out loud right now. Can't believe it's being recorded.
That's totally fine. Yeah, I think I think that's really great growth to have, though. That's a great realization to have, and I'm glad that your cousins came over so you could have that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Emily, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
The the added piece of being Catholic, Filipino Catholic, is another layer that's not really spoken about. A lot of Filipinos are Catholic because it's a Catholic country, but there's also different religions, in the Philippines, not just only Catholic. There's many forms of Christianity along with, Islam and just many, many, many other kinds. But specifically being a Filipino American Catholic young girl, there was also I see now that I was treated differently, or at least expected to behave differently than even my partner, him also being Filipino, growing up as a male Filipino. We are definitely sheltered more, protected more, and expected to behave a certain way, know how to cook. Well, not to the best, but know how to clean for sure, and know how to behave like a docile young lady, and they call it be demure. You just want to look pretty, but you don't want to speak up too much and cause a ruckus. And so at home, we had fun with our cousins and stuff, but even within that, even within my cousins and stuff, the expectation was to stay um like in the role of a young girl, which is to be like innocent and quiet and very conservative and reserved. Um, I was different at school. I'm not saying I was loud and rambunctious. That was not the case. It's more like my behavior at school was the opposite. I was very much outgoing as a student leader and already knew how to give directions and even manage and delegate things to people. So I think even that was kind of like a disparity in terms of like Filipino American like gender identity, you know um having to do that. I wasn't very I still don't like chores. Okay, let's not turn the camera and show what's happening around this area. But but there's always an expectation to do that and to give back to your parents and to take care of parents and your family in a very nurturing way, on top of also trying to achieve as a student and as a leader. So it's a lot of pressure, as I'm thinking back now and realizing it. So I think there's a difference. I don't know if I can speak for the male, a male counterpart, but based on comparing my experience with my partner, I don't think that was necessarily the same.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually like I'm taking my first like feminist theory class this semester, so I think like a lot of what you're saying really like makes sense. Yeah. Um, so kind of like going back to what you were saying about like the Filipino American community in Houston, and also maybe like more in general, the Asian American community in Houston. In your opinion, what is it doing well, and also how can it improve for the future?
Well, I think the fact that there are more organizations popping up for specific niches, like for example, the Filipinx Artists of Houston, it's a Filipino group for artists, right? Fonz, same thing. It's an organization for people who, believe in preserving Filipino American history, documenting lived experiences, and teaching more about essentially who we are and what we've gone through. So I think that's good because I had said earlier in my interview, starting off in FYP, that became a organization that kind of bridged that age gap between 25 to let's say 45. But since that time frame, there's been more organizations, these two that I just shared, along with let's say Unipro, and I'm sure there are others that I don't even know about that are reaching out to people post college, but before retirement, and so I think that's what's good, that's happening. And I think it's because there's already, organizations are doing things to raise awareness about Filipino American identity. And at the same time, if you notice the organizations that I've shared, um, they're not focused on like regional locations or specific like subcultural identities. In the Filipino community, with what I call like the boomer generation who have their organizations, many of those organizations are focused on language or the region that they lived in back home in the Philippines, or even here in Houston, like the location, east, west, north, south, Houston, let's say. Um, that, or they combine both your location here in Houston and your language and like where you came from back home, So many of the older generation groups are focused on that because it was, if you think about it, it was a way for them to identify people of the same background, of the same demographics or location from back home. Um, you could say it was their version of Facebook back then, right? But I think I'm seeing now, just in my initial preliminary ideas and even in my research as I was thinking, that organizations like Fonz and Filipinx, Uniprof, FYP, it's kind of a new generation organizations that are not necessarily focusing on regional language or site-specific Filipino communities. It's focusing on like broader topics like history or art, right? Or community betterment, not necessarily on, just only from where your location. So I think that's the good part of this. But at the same time, this generation who like me and younger or even a little bit older, who are joining these more broad Filipino American organizations, are they joining the boomer generation organizations, right? And so I've been questioning and starting to question the viability and the sustainability of those organizations that have we call them titos and titas, which is aunt, uncles, / lolos and lolas, which is grandma and grandpas. Like those organizations that have been here, let's say since the 60s or the 70s and the 80s, which were created at a time when they were in their young professional ages, right? But they're getting older, they're growing older, and their children may or may not be taking up the helm. So I wouldn't call it bad, but it's more like, what are we as a community going to do about, let's say, the viability and the sustainability of those organizations? And I have a hunch that perhaps some of them will not last. They may not survive if the youth, which youth is everyone who's not, in that age range. So you could still be a youth and be 45 in their eyes. you know, um, if there's no way for the next generation to take up the torch. And I think that's a main concern, a problem, I think, you know, which is the succession planning, and passing down, because the legacy of that organization will not continue or or even be known if there's nobody to take over, right? And have we trained, have we have we molded and mentored the youth, the next generation, to take over those organizations? Or are we at a point in the evolution of our community that those organizations are no longer, what's the word? They're no longer as relevant to this generation of Filipino Americans because of living in a Filipino American, specifically Houston, Texas environment, right? Perhaps those organizations might be best suited for maybe folks who were born in the Philippines, in those regions, and they want to gather with people who are from their barrio or from their township, right? So those may continue to survive and to live as younger professionals, right, from the Philippines start coming here and raising their families. But I do think that that's something we still need to kind of look at. So that's why I think in bonds it's so important that, let's say we work with these other Filipino American organizations, especially the older generation organizations, to document, their history, or to open up, a box at the Woodson Research Center, and bring their gala books, bring all of, their agendas and all the things that, they were doing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So, even if that organization doesn't live for another 5 years, let's say, they have a history that this existed, because all that hard work and that love and that care that they put into in the last 20, 30, 40 years in that organization to build a Filipino community, that should never be forgotten. And so I think that's what's important. I don't know if my community, I'll be honest, I don't think they're even thinking that. This same question, if asked, I think for another Filipino, they'd be saying, well, Filipinos are at each other's throats, or like they're always competing against each other. There's crab mentality. There's like, this organization is better than your organization, and there's politics involved, etc. To me, that's just a superficial, and if anything, that's what's holding us back from actually thinking on a bigger macro level of the viability of these organizations. Because we shouldn't say that those older organizations are any less. They work differently, right? Because they came from a different generation. They may not be using a computer to archive everything, right? Unlike, in bonds right now, we are using all the social media tools, and that automatically archives what our digital flyers are, right? So if anyone ever wanted to know what we've done in the past, they just go to Facebook or our website and see, oh, wow, they've done all these things. But perhaps for those older generations, they don't have that access, and they don't know how to do those things. And then the other part is they want the youth to help, right? But the quote unquote youth, which is people like me or other generations, they're busy doing other work in the community like we're doing, right? And starting our own organizations. And that's why, these nonprofit organizations that we have, all of it is mostly volunteer based. I don't know of one Filipino American Houston organization that has paid staff. So in other Asian American organizations, nonprofits specifically, they have some paid staff. Not all, okay? Because it takes a lot to get to the point where you have paid staff. But many of the ones that are gonna survive another 50 years, right? They've reached a point where they can actually pay staff to do administrative technological things, right? And so I think it's our generation, for those of us who, let's say, went to college here, have, you know, experience in the nonprofit or in the corporate world, we need to give back to our community and help those areas in a way where we can build sustainability for these organizations, whether it's through human resources or, you know, making sure we finance and budget for staffing. Because right now it was, many of these organizations were built out of building a sense of belonging for social and network purposes, or maybe even religious purposes, not necessarily because they were there to change the world, right? They were there to create a community in their own world. But we're now seeing the future. We're in the future now of what they had created in the past, and we can't just let that history die. So, yeah, a part of me sometimes feel like I'm the only one who feels this way. I don't really talk too much about it, but now that it's going to be documented, I guess it will be heard. um, and I've shared this in private with several Filipino American organizers and activists, that I think this is a concern we should have, because essentially the histories of our grandparents and our aunts and uncles who started these organizations will cease to exist in our future history. And that's not the memories we want to have about our community. You know, we want to show that there was things before me, you know, and I think that's what's important as well, because there's a saying that we have, no history, no history means no self, no self. But if you know your history, KNOW, then you know KNOW yourself. So it's just a circle of life in these things. And I think that's an impending issue that I don't know even how we're going to even address it, because it feels like just an evolutionary transformational kind of thing, but nobody really talks about it because maybe it's not even valued at the end of the day. It's just, oh, there's another Filipino organization just gone or inactive or not doing anything because everybody is essentially retired or passed away.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a valid concern, and it's also something like I wouldn't have considered otherwise. And yeah, but I also think it's like kind of like a cycle, like kind of like it's always gonna happen, and we just have to prepare for it.
Right, right. Last year I went to a Filipino nonprofit like summit. Before COVID, I was able to travel to go there, and they started talking about succession planning. That was the first time I ever heard of the word succession planning within a Filipino American nonprofit organization. And that should be just as important as starting up an organization, right? Because if you start up an organization but you don't know how it's going to end or how it's going to be moved on or passed on, then it's just as good as not starting one. Because you know it means it didn't exist at that point, or it existed for just a little sliver of time. But the other problem is because people do this out of the kindness of their hearts. It's 100% volunteer, you know, and when you volunteer, you can't expect people, you know, to work as if it's their full-time job. Some people may feel like it's their full-time job because they really feel passionate about this work, but that's not necessarily everyone, right? And so that's why I personally feel we need to create some kind of infrastructure in the future, or perhaps an organization or of some kind, a structure of some kind that allows us to finance more stability and more sustainability. I don't know how that's going to happen, but I would hope at least in Fonz we're going to try to do something to that extent, you know, to do that. Because like you asked me, does anybody want to grow up and become a community leader? No, because parents will say there's no money in it. You know, that's a waste of your time. Why are you going to give back to the community when you need to give back to your family, you got to raise your kids, you got to go to college, you got to do all these things for yourself. Um, you know, but to have to give back to the community is in line with Filipino values, which is giving back to where you came from, giving back to your elders, giving back and respecting your culture. So it's really interesting how that kind of like American Western philosophy, like take care of your own, comes into play when it comes to maybe some community service.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. Um, so just for some kind of final like wrap up thoughts, I guess this is more kind of like the fun section, but if you
Yeah.
could go back in time and give a piece of advice to your younger self, what would it be?
Advice to my younger self. Um, I think the advice I would have is to be strong and to stand up for what you believe in. But what happens if you don't know what you believe in, right? I would probably encourage my younger self to listen more to my intuition, to that inner voice of me. And I think I did for the most part. And that's perhaps why I had so much strength as being an active young child or student in, the areas of performance, of music, of the arts and the humanities and leadership positions. I rarely told my parents until I already got the part or until I already got the award or something that happened. I would always test myself and prove myself first before I even brought any information back home. They would just only find out, oh, you're you're a leader in this, or you're the lead part of this. They didn't even know that I applied, and so I already had an internal intuition, but I also think I held back from probably saying my truth about my major, right? I probably shouldn't have majored in the sciences or gone through the whole thing, you know. I It would have been better that I should have explored, the ethnic studies or Asian American studies or sociology or something humanities, essentially. Um, but I think that was because there was maybe not the resources from on my parents' end or in the community where, is there a Filipino American career fair? Was there an opportunity for me to see Filipinos in other industries besides nursing? A lot of people in my family were nurses, or in the medical field. If not, they were in, blue collar jobs or self-employed. So I think at that point in time, I would have told myself, to listen to my intuition, follow my gut instinct, but also research and look for discover other, explore other options and opportunities, whether your parents know or don't know, or you know, your community may or may not know, and at that time we didn't have the internet. So it's not like I could Google, you had to go to your school, college library, a college counseling, little library nook, right? And like they had college videotapes and pamphlets of universities and colleges you wanted to go to. So if I knew then, I would have told myself, like, you know, create a Filipino American career fair so that you can find out what kinds of jobs and opportunities out there, so that you can see the ate and kuya. Ate means older sister and older brother, but that's what we call just like people who are older than us, than our age. So you could have found some ates and kuyas who were in different industries, and I do believe my life would be totally different if I pursued a life that was just focused on like the arts and the creative and the humanities. But not to say that I don't like what's happened now, because I realize I can explore that now because I have a choice and I can, and so I guess that's what I would I tell myself to just be strong, listen to your gut instinct, and also ask questions, to get you the resources you think you need to get you to the dreams or the goals that you want to have. So, I mean, I guess one thing did come true. I wanted to become a doctor. So I became one, but just not a medical one. So it's just a difference in perspective.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, and I know you kind of like alluded to this before, but if you decide to have children in the future, if they were to watch this interview video in the future, what would you want to say to them?
Wow. That's so funny. That's a question I ask people in their interviews, or like in my grandma, or like my mom, my parents. Like, what would you say to your grandparent, your grandchildren, your future grandchildren? Well, this is what I would say to my future grandchildren and future family. I want to say you are here not just because of me, but because of my parents, my partner's parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. Um, you are living in the way you are the way you are living your life right now because of um the hardship and the struggles that they went through, that we went through, but also the opportunities that they opened and gave to me, and that hopefully we are giving to you. And so my message to them is to continue to learn more about their Filipino American identity in their own way, um, by learning about their family history, learning about Filipino American history in general, and also to find ways to give back to your community, because it's really through this community work that you find a life fulfillment that you can't really find, necessarily in, in a 9 to 5 job, or even in, let's say, raising a family per se, right? So giving back to others, and giving back to specifically others who look like you and have gone through similar experiences like you, I think is going to be a way for you to find a piece of life satisfaction, contentment, happiness, and fulfillment. um, at least that's from my based on my experience, doing this type of work, being in funds, or being in all the different Filipino American organizations and activities, or even not, even just giving back to the community in general, I think is something that, community service and being a service to others is something that truly comes authentically from a place in yourself that is not taking but giving. You know, you don't have to give money, you don't have to give, things. You just give your time and the talents and the skills that you personally have. And that's enough to make a change and a difference in people's lives, which make up the community.
Yeah, I think that's a really great message to share. And my last question for you, what are your favorite things to do outside of your career?
Great. Okay. So I outside of my career, I like nature. So, we're trying to be more healthy in my family. And so we really enjoy walking outside in nature, in the forest, or whether it's a park or a nice long waterway, biking. I was so blessed. I got a bike for my birthday last year. Yes, we have to do something during COVID times to stay healthy. So we really enjoy being outdoors when we can. Um, we also are a family of food. So, we really love going out to eat, but because of COVID times, we've had to cook more at home. So we, to a certain extent, really do enjoy cooking, and cooking good food is fun. Um, Other things I like to do, I know I had mentioned I have some personal projects like, recording my family history, writing down their information. We even have this online platform where we've put our family tree on there. So thank God that's there. So I do enjoy that. So that's an outstanding project that I have, and that will be continue, I guess, as I continue to to grow up and to live. So I have several people to interview just like this, but for my family. Um, and then I also, I mean, wow, a lot of my life is Zoom right now. Zoom and meetings. So I'm being like, what? Oh, well, come on now, y'all. Somebody's gonna have to have some, streaming company on their tablets or something like, Netflix, Hulu, watching movies. I mean, that's an extension of lived experiences, right? Watching stories and motion films. So watching movies and series, docu-series, that was where probably a lot of my time is spent. I'm sure a lot of people too. So I really do enjoy watching movies or mostly really like TV shows, right? Like the TV shows that are episodic and you can binge watch the shows. And I like all different kinds of stories. And probably that's why, like, there's period pieces and then like current times and then documentaries. Um, because I think at one point when I was in high school, I thought I wanted to do film. I entered into a film competition with my friends. My cousin was already studying film, and I asked him to film us, right? Me and my friends came up with the premise, and I wanted to enter. I wanted us to win the $500 prize or whatever it was. We worked so hard on it. Me and my cousin edited, well, he edited, of course, but I was right there with him. And I think the teacher was pretty annoyed because I kept asking questions. And they viewed our film to the school, and we won. Probably because of the persistence of asking all the time. But I guess we did a good job. So yeah, that could still be my life. I'm not saying it can't be, but documentation has always, I guess, preserving stories and narrative. Oh yeah, going back to my dissertation, the narrative inquiry, which is inquiring about the stories of people's lived experiences, specifically Filipino American students' lived experiences. So yeah, I like to write. I like to journal. Now, I don't have a steady diet stream of writing and journaling, but I keep that to myself in terms of like, it's a part of my wellness now. And I've been writing since I was 13, I think, 13 or 14 or 15, young age. So I have a box of journals from that age, and I still write even till today. Um, if Yeah, I would definitely recommend people to journal. It's not something you have to share with anyone. No, it's for you. It's for your own self. And sometimes I wouldn't even write for a whole year. Like it'd be one entry, and then next page is the next year. But it just kind of depends. And I think writing has gotten me through a lot of like mental health wellness. Um, it just and just expressing myself. It's really probably one of the best forms of art for me is journaling. So journaling, I love to read on vacation, but as do anybody, right? So I do like to read um, for fun, but not as voracious as many readers who say they're readers. Yeah, I haven't read anything this year. So, but I love to do all those things. I can't think of anything else. Spend time with my parents and my family. Like that's all we do. Netflix, spend time with family when we can, cook, sleep, and Zoom. That's all we do.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely relate to like the Netflix part. And
Do you?
yeah, definitely maybe a
We're
bit
gonna have
too
to
much.
edit those out, right? Yeah, like what are you watching right now?
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that I have planned, but if you have anything else to add, you can.
Um, I think a significant portion of my Filipino identity kind of came at a crossing last year before COVID blew up. I had a a wonderful, amazing chance to visit the Philippines last January, February timeframe with my matriarchal aunt. And it was an amazing experience. And just going back and seeing the community and the people and places where my family are from, I think that's another key piece to learning who you are as Filipino. Now, some people are like either second, third, fourth, fifth, or even farther generation out, let's say Filipino, and they may not know where they're from back home in the Philippines. Um, but even just like going back there and seeing Filipinos in the Philippines makes you stop and reflect about who you are as a Filipino American. I was different, but I was also the same in many ways. Like they were surprised I could speak the language and understand. Um, but I could tell that they could tell that I was not from there. And a part of me also felt a little bit inauthentic because I was realizing that the Filipinos in the Philippines are, I guess what I was saying to myself, the true real Filipinos, because they were born there, this is how they live. And I was so much more cognizant. This is the second time I went to the Philippines as an adult. And I was much more cognizant of my westernized, Americanized thoughts. I didn't want to impose that, but I obviously have a lens that I cannot separate out from my own personal beliefs and thoughts, right? So I knew that how I was viewing things the first time when I went to the Philippines, which was about a decade before, it was too much of a culture shock, and I knew I couldn't live without some of the amenities that America had offered. But coming back to it and coming back to it the last year, realizing, really how beautiful everything is and how I'm connected to all of that where my ancestors came from. You know, it's different. I'm a person who probably should have never came here, right? Like if my parents and their families never immigrated, I would have been born or raised there in the Philippines. My life would have been totally different, not necessarily good or bad. And I think that's the thing. A lot of the times we say like, oh, as Filipino Americans, right? We're saying like, oh, we're so blessed living here. We're living this kind of fruitful, rich life in comparison to the poverty that is compared in the Philippines. But I went to the city and in the province areas, and yes, in the westernized standards of social economics, it is poverty, right? But if you just live amongst the people there as a Filipino in that environment, you may not know anything differently. And that's your worldview. And I think I just took from that I have to respect different worldviews and where people come from and the Filipino lived experience that's happening in the Philippines. Um, so I hope one day, when things get better, I have another chance to go back to the Philippines. I can take my partner who really hasn't been there as an adult ever and my future children that we'll have. Like I would love for all of us to go back to get connected to the land, get connected to the people. And I also want a vacation, like they've got some really great spots in the Philippines that I've never even been to. And so I want to also be a tourist, I guess, in my ancestors' homeland, and to enjoy and to respectfully enjoy that. So I guess that's kind of like my take on all of this. Hopefully one day, hopefully one day, we're all changed because of COVID. Um, this is going to change this is changing and has changed our community. We still don't know the impact yet, right? Because everything is in hindsight, in retrospect, 2020, which happened in 2020. All right. So it'll be retrospect 2020 in 2020. But I that the trip from last year makes it even more special that I even had a chance, to go and to spend that time and to learn more about the culture and the community and my family history. And not everyone has that privilege. It's an expensive ticket to travel even without COVID, you know? So we bring a little piece of that Filipino culture, here in the work that we do. That's the foundation and the framework, right? But doesn't mean we can't question certain things um, from that perspective. And why I say that is when I went to the Philippines, I really felt like an outsider, or I started criticizing in my head as a Western person of like the images and the ads that I would see. There's a huge push for white skin in the Philippines, and all of the big billboards that are, even in Asia, right? Just Asia in general, the billboards are like skyscraper high, and it's usually like a very pale, beautiful girl who's very thin or whatever. And I was thinking, and I was starting to impose my own beliefs on that, starting to get angry and upset, that how dare you, put this information to the people here. But I also realized like I can't impose my beliefs, on that. That's the framework that they live in, right? But we can um discuss, dialogue, and even break it down, and hopefully maybe get people to think differently in regards to that. Because I know I do, even now in terms of image, right? Body image, beauty image, as a Pinay. So those things, yeah, I don't know what I'm saying, but essentially that's what I wanted to add, that I went to the Philippines and it changed my life. And I think every time I will travel there in the future to come will always change my life and the people that I go with.
That's awesome. Yeah. I fingers crossed that COVID goes away soon so you can have that like experience with your partner and your children sometime in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a missing link for many Filipinos because they may not have gone back to the Philippines to see where their families come from and where they still are. I have relatives who still live in a province setting where their 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 home floor is the dirt of the ground. They live in a hut, and they have all the furniture an American young girl would have in their bedroom, but it's just in a hut and soil floor, and that's a culture shock for me as an American Filipino, right? Purposely putting American first before being Filipino, because that shock comes from being American. So yeah. So that's it. This has been such a great experience. I know I've taken up a lot of time. This is a lot to transcribe, Emily.
No worries
But
at all. Thank you
you were
so
doing
much.
so great. Just cut it all.
Oh, okay. No worries. Thank you for doing this interview with me. I really appreciate it. And also thank you for being like willing to be vulnerable. It means a lot. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I knew it was my grandma's death anniversary today, but I didn't realize I was going to talk about her,
Yeah.
today. But it makes sense. It makes so much sense. And it's probably her way of being honored today. That's the other thing. Like, I feel like the work that I do, I have to remind myself that this work is important, and on a greater transcendental sense, it honors my grandma, or it honors my ancestors and my parents. And it really also honors our future, right? Because we care about this type of work, even what you're doing, Emily, right? You're paving the path. We are paving the path for our future families and community to reap the benefits of this, right? As well as live in a better community, I'm hoping, in the future, because it has, right? Like, I guess saying this out loud for the first time, really, really is eye-opening to me. So I mean, I had one interview, and I think about it, for a dissertation for another Filipino American who had a dissertation. And I was, I guess, a participant of her research. And I did talk about my life a little bit, but I really focused a lot more on like my work, like real work in higher ed. And but this particular interview that you shared with me has really has really opened up some doors that I never really thought about. So I really do appreciate um, being a part of this amazing project.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much.